Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here. Now this is really two things. First, it's the TinyPilot KVM or TinyPilot Voyager KVM solution, and it's also the exact reason they don't let me edit videos because otherwise everything would have music and look like that. But I managed to sneak it into this review. Now, if you saw this and you thought to yourself, hey, this TinyPilot Voyager KVM kind of looks like a Raspberry Pi 4 in a case with like an extra HDMI port up here, like, is that basically what it is? And the answer to that is yes, but kind of. And it's actually way more exciting than that, though. The really short version of what this is a Raspberry Pi that has a couple of connectors and features that have been designed, and specifically some software as well, to allow you to hook this up to the network on one end and then also up to a machine, whether that's a server, a desktop, or whatever you want to on the other end, and be able to manage it remotely. Now, what's really interesting about this is that this is by far not really a new concept. If you go to co-location facilities, you will definitely see one of these. They're absolutely everywhere. I think of the last 30 co-location facilities I've been to, probably 28, 29 of them, like virtually every single one, I've seen this exact piece of hardware. Now that I have it turned the right way, what this is a Lantronix Spider KVM device. And it basically has some network ports. It also has a serial console port on board. And then it has a nice little VGA connector as well as two USB ports. So the idea is that you can hook this up to a server, whether or not it has a IPMI out-of-band management interface or enabled iKVM out-of-band management, and you can hook it up to a server. You can do things like you can get a remote keyboard. You can also use the mouse to get the video, and then you can also mount remote media. And so back in the old days, I guess of a decade ago, if we can call that old days, you would have a lot of servers that didn't have any out-of-band management built in. And even to this day, there are people that will go and install servers, but that are really based on like consumer motherboards, and they'll put them into a data center and then try managing them remotely. And frankly, hardware is way better than it used to be. So, just installing whatever, even if it doesn't have a BMC, if you put a nice consumer motherboard into a server chassis, put it in a data center, it'll most likely work. And if you configure Linux or whatever operating system before you send it, you're probably going to be absolutely fine until the day that something bad happens. So for all those old servers that don't have BMCs, for people that are basically using consumer workstation gear that don't have BMCs and putting those into data centers, and also for those folks that are not paying for that upgraded iKVM enabled license for companies like Dell, HPE, and Lenovo, something that is super useful still is the ability to attach an external device like this Lantronix Spider and being able to do all of your management out of band. And when I talk about co-location facilities and hosting facilities, the reason that these are really common is that the way that basically the industry does it is they put these things onto a separate management network that they can drop into different racks, or they'll have a cable that's cabled into a different rack. You hook this up to the server that's causing an issue or that needs to be serviced, and then that server can be accessed remotely. It saves an absolute ton of time, and these devices are super popular and they're great. But with anything that's 10 years old, there still are a couple problems and challenges with this Lantronix Spider. Specifically, and perhaps the big one, is the fact that the vast majority of older units used Java. So if you were to go and take this unit, especially, I don't know when this was made. Okay, I have no idea. I looked and there's no date on it, but this is definitely an older unit. And so when it originally came out, it had a Java-based iKVM functionality instead of HTML5, which is really the new way that you really want, so you don't have to have Java installed and have to worry about, do you have an outdated version of Java, or there's some kind of security things, all that kind of stuff. So basically, server management interfaces have all gone to HTML5 for their BMCs, and these things have as well. There was a period of time where it was pretty hard to upgrade these to an HTML5 iKVM solution. Instead, you had to use the Java, and that became an issue when it would no longer work. The other challenge is that these are frankly made really for servers. I mean, there's a VGA port. What normal desktop has a VGA port at this point. And then also you have your 2 old USB ports. Now, the nice thing is that these actually have a serial console port built in, so that makes it really easy if you just need a console connection to, something like a firewall or a switch or what have you. You can actually use this exact same device and do the same thing that you would do with a server, just using a serial console port. And I don't think this is the actual version that has this feature. However, we do have units, I think they're in the data center right now, that also have a power control module. So you're able to go power up and power down devices remotely using the same interface, just like you would if you had a BMC, except it uses an external box. So I've seen some other folks on YouTube and on the web talk about this TinyPilot thing as, it's replacing these like big KVM solutions. But really what this little TinyPilot thing is doing is it's really taking the place of this Lantronix Spider. This is the target market for this. So a couple months ago, we had most of the Lantronix Spiders that have been upgraded to HTML5, but still some of them hadn't. And it was just getting to be absolutely just annoying. It was just an annoying process if you had to use Java, and the Java does not work because of security reasons. And so Michael, the creator of this TinyPilot project, reached out to me and he said, hey, I read STH and I have this new thing. I think a lot of the readers on STH would be interested in it. It's basically a remote KVM solution. Specifically though, he said that it used an HTML5 browser, and I said, oh, that is exactly what I want. And just so we can get this out of the way, Michael did offer to send a review unit, but I completely declined and I said absolutely not. And so I purchased the Voyager top-end unit, but I gave Michael one condition to be able to do this review. I said, for us to be able to do the review, you must have basically feature parity with the Lantronix Spider, and specifically the one feature that I really want is remote media. I can't tell you how many times having the ability to remotely mount media on one of our baseboard management controllers that's not in a server, that's in the data center, is just a super useful feature. You just, every once in a while you need it. You don't need it every day, but every once in a while you do need that feature. And having the ability to remotely mount and install an OS, even in our production servers, is just absolutely awesome. Now the Lantronix Spider totally does that, and the TinyPilot KVM hasn't done that. Well, it hadn't done that because just about a week ago or so, I got an email from Michael saying, hey, we finally have that feature that you've been waiting for the last 6 months. But hey, it's ready to go and ready for you to go try out. So if you want to go do your review now, you totally can. And he sent me an image, and I think that image just went live around May 6th, 2021. So the short or long story of what this is it's basically an open source version of a Lantronix Spider. But as always, this is STH, so let's go dig into that a little bit. So first off, this is the Voyager version, which is a $300 basically bundle, and it comes with more than this that we're going to get into in a sec, but it is definitely not cheap. It is less expensive than the new Lantronix Spiders, but it's also more expensive than a used Lantronix Spider, so that is just something to keep in mind. And what you get for that is you get a 2 GB Raspberry Pi 4 in this nice little 3D printed chassis. There's also a fan for cooling, which is actually important because this will get pretty hot. And what you'll see is that there's also this extra HDMI port here. So we're not going to go into all the, what is a Raspberry Pi 4, because I think most of you on YouTube that are watching this probably already know, but it's something you can get inexpensively off the shelf and really do rapid prototyping and build a solution like this very quickly because you don't have to go design the entire system. And this little HDMI port is really important because this is the HDMI port that basically performs a lot of the magic of this solution. It is an HDMI capture port, which is based on a Toshiba part. And the function of this port is that basically you take the output from a PC or a server or whatever it is, and you put it into this HDMI port, and then that is captured, and some of that's, I guess, offloaded, and then it's able to be processed by the system. So hopefully we will have some B-roll of just setting up Windows 10 on a Project Tiny Mini micro node using this solution with an HDMI cable. Of course, since it's an HDMI cable, you could also get a DisplayPort cable and use that as well, and sometimes we have to do that on Project Tiny Mini Micro if there's no HDMI port available. And so hopefully what you're seeing right now is a sped up version of a Windows 10 installation process using one of these Project Tiny Mini micro nodes. Now, you might be sitting there and thinking to yourself, wait a sec, okay, I totally get HDMI, I get DisplayPort, but the Lantronix one and most servers, frankly, don't have a DisplayPort or HDMI port. They all use VGA. And so for that, there's this little optional adapter. I think it's like $15 or something like that. And this is basically what lets you convert, your VGA into an HDMI signal. You will notice that we do have a cable here, and it's a little USB cable, and this USB cable is specifically designed so that way you can power the adapter because you need a little bit of power to make this adapter work. So that really takes care of the video side, and we talk about the iKVM and remote media mounting facilities. You also need a couple other things. First, you of course need a network connection, but the Raspberry Pi has the gigabit Ethernet, so that's really not an issue. You also have Wi-Fi, which is blocked by default, but it's pretty easy to go and enable Wi-Fi if you really want that. But as part of the iKVM solution, well, we have a keyboard video mouse as KVM, and so what about the keyboard input and mouse input, but also the virtual storage input for the remote media? And to answer that, we have a whole bunch of cables over here. I mean, this is just a lot of cables, and let's kind of go through what's going on. All right, so the first thing we should talk about, let's start with the power adapter. And you might not know why you need a power adapter, because you might say like, well, if you have a server and you have a USB port, can't you just kind of like power your Raspberry Pi off of the USB port? And you kind of can, but if you've actually used other KVM solutions like that Lantronix Spider, you can also do the same thing there. You can plug in the USB ports, draw power from the server, and power the KVM, the Spider KVM from that. And of course, if you've ever done that, you know the one major and giant issue with even trying that, and that's just the fact that if you do power it via the system, what you're most likely going to have happen is that when you reboot the system or cold, power cycle the system or whatever it is, you will end up powering off those USB ports, which then power off your KVM solution, in that case the Spider, or this TinyPilot Voyager. And when you do power off the system and the Voyager or the Spider turn off, what ends up happening is that when you turn the power back on, they need to then reboot. And that's perfectly okay, except if you need to get into the BIOS, because what will happen is that you'll often pass the BIOS, and so you'll be into the OS already by the time that these KVM solutions boot. So on the Lantronix Spider, what you typically do is one of two things. There's actually an auxiliary power port, so you have I think a micro USB or something like that port on those, and then you plug that in, and that you can have a power adapter and power it that way. The other option that sometimes you can actually use, just kind of a little hack, is that you can actually use a powered USB hub, and then just put the two USB ports into that USB hub. That will allow you to power the entire Lantronix Spider, but then also you can get the extra port or two if you really want that to go. I don't know why, but maybe you'd want to get an extra port, and then you can also plug it into the machine using that USB hub, and everything will work perfectly fine. And the reason I bring up that little hack is because that's actually kind of what's going on with the TinyPilot. So the first USB cable goes from the power adapter to this little box right here. And this little box is basically something that allows you to put both data and power onto the cable. It's a USB Type-C cable that powers the Raspberry Pi 4 that's at the heart of the Voyager. But for this USB Type-C port, we don't just want to have power go into the Raspberry Pi 4. What we also want is the ability to connect the Raspberry Pi 4 to the system that we want to control, because we need to get something, a USB input that basically does our mouse, our keyboard, and also our remote media. And that's what this cable's for, and this little splitter box allows you to do it. And so that's how we get our power, our keyboard and mouse into this, or the system that you're testing. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, wait a sec, but if I just need to do a USB to USB connection, aren't there other USB ports on this Raspberry Pi 4? And the answer to that is yes, but we are using this little box. So that is the hardware behind the TinyPilot Voyager, but let's get into the software side, because I actually think that's a little bit more interesting. At its absolute base, this is basically a Raspberry Pi. And that's really important, because if you need to do things that are a little bit different, it's actually really nice to have that Raspberry Pi there. And I'll give you a really easy, simple example. And this is the new Xilinx Kria development kit. So this is actually an FPGA, has an ARM processor on it, but it's the dev kit for the Xilinx Kria. And one of the things that you need during the setup process, we're gonna have a video on this soon, but this is a brand new system, and you need a serial console input into the system, or control into the system, to be able to really start the setup process. So since you have a Raspberry Pi, you just basically use an FTDI cable that gives you your serial console into the Xilinx SOM. And that brings us just to the quick point that it's not only servers that can use this, it's also a lot of the development platforms. There's things like that brand new Xilinx Kria system, but then there's also things like the NVIDIA Jetson Nano and those types of systems. So there's a whole bunch of things that necessarily don't have a VGA port anymore, and they're really relying on that HDMI or DisplayPort, which kind of means that if you have a console and you have that DisplayPort and HDMI, this is actually a pretty good solution for it. I actually set up my Jetson Nano with this device a couple months ago, and it was great. Now, with the purchase of a TinyPilot Voyager, you actually get the TinyPilot Pro license, which I think is like $100 or so as an add-on. And it basically gives you some, I guess, higher end features than you get on the base open source project. I should mention real quick that you can definitely just go get your own Raspberry Pi, your own case and all that kind of stuff, get all the components, download the software via GitHub, and be up and running with the vast majority of the functionality we're going to show here. There are a couple features such as that remote media mounting that you do not get if you just go through GitHub, and so that's, I guess, a little bit of a difference. But overall, if you just need the basic KVM functionality, you can just totally build this yourself if you want to. But frankly, I like supporting people that come up with ingenious solutions for legacy problems. You may have seen that we previously did the Windows 10 Pro installation using the old interface for TinyPilot, but the new TinyPilot Pro interface is, I guess, very updated compared to the older version that we had on this unit for a long time. And once you install this on the network, it's super easy. You just point your web browser to TinyPilot, and then you're basically at the web interface. And you can see that we're actually on HTTPS here. We could go set up our own certificate for this, and that's probably actually a good idea, but because we just got the image and are doing this video kind of quickly, since this has taken like 6 months to do this review, we didn't actually set that up, but you totally can do that. Now on the main screen, you're basically going to see two major items. The first major item that you're going to see is on the top of the screen. You're going to see the, I guess, video feed. And then on the bottom, you're going to see a keyboard. Now at the very bottom, it'll also have a connection status along with, it'll show you your key presses. That key pressing has actually moved during the different versions. So that's something a little bit different. I wish that there was a macro feature that you could just kind of define macros and had things like Control-Alt-Delete, because that's one that is certainly very useful. But hopefully that's going to be a future feature. In the menu system, you're going to see that you can require a username and password. And that's really important because basically with this into a system, you're basically giving like full access to whatever system it is, like you're sitting at the system itself. And so usually it's a good idea to require some kind of authentication to be able to get into a system. I will just really briefly note here that this is an area that is good, but it's also not as good as you would see with the Lantronix Spider in its current form. Lantronix has the ability to use things like Radius servers. If you want to authenticate over some kind of like corporate directory or something like that, you can do that with the Lantronix solution, but you don't necessarily have that here. Still, just having the ability to do the username and password is a big deal. The next one, which is the new feature, that is the reason that we haven't done this review for like 6 months, and that feature is the remote mounting of media. Through the web interface, you can click upload and then basically just browse to a local ISO file, upload that ISO, and then you're basically ready to go. Now that ISO is stored on the 16 gigabyte card or SD card that's in here. I do kind of wish that it was a little bit bigger of an SD card, like 32 gigs, because that would allow you to put more remote, more media on the device. You might want to have Ubuntu, Windows, maybe Windows Server, maybe FreeBSD, and then a couple different versions, because you may want to have like 1804 and 20.04, and then maybe the newest version. So a little bit more storage would have been nice. Still, all you have to do is click, okay, we're going to mount that thing, and then it's mounted onto the system that you want to use it for. In Windows and Linux, worked absolutely no problem. One area that we did see that we did not see the thing working is actually with the brand new M1 Mac Mini. We tried remotely mounting with that, and it just kind of threw us an error, and tried it for a while. It didn't work. Hopefully that's something that gets fixed in the future. There's also a newer feature where you can go and check for updates in the web interface. You can change the host name, and this is absolutely a huge deal, because if you have a bunch of them that are on your network, you don't necessarily want them all to be called TinyPilot. Of course not. There's a section on video settings that we're going to talk a little bit more when we talk to the performance of the solution. You also have debug logs and the ability to power on and off the TinyPilot Voyager. You may just want to reset things if something gets wonky, and so that's just a feature that's nice that you have it there. You can also SSH into this and reboot it that way, so that's always an option as well. There's a screenshot feature, which takes a screenshot. Another really useful feature is the ability to set your cursor that's being displayed. And the reason for that is that when you think about having a local and a remote system and accessing the remote system through a browser, you're going to have a pointer most likely on your local system but there's also going to be a pointer on the remote system. And so by having the ability to do this customization on what your pointer looks like on your local system, it means that you can actually differentiate it between what's your local and what's your remote pointer. That way you don't click on the wrong thing. So let's talk a little bit about compatibility and performance. Overall compatibility, especially if you're on a Windows system, seems to be pretty good. We tried it for Dell, HP, Lenovo. We tried it on Supermicro servers, Tyin servers, Dell servers, HPE servers, Lenovo servers, Inspur servers. I mean, man, we tried this on a whole bunch of different solutions, and just generally it worked pretty well. The WeWin Mountain Jade Ampere Ultra platform, when we tried this a couple months ago using this solution, it didn't really work too well at all. But maybe that was just because that was a pretty early, system, and so okay. The other big one is that we do have a bunch of the M1 Mac Minis, and we just got the 10 gigabit Ethernet version of the M1 Mac Mini. And with those, there are a couple little weird things. Like when you first turn them on to set them up, if you just use this instead of like plugging in an actual, mouse and video and all that kind of stuff, there's something that's really weird, I guess, and that's the fact that you can type things on the keyboard and you can move your pointer and the mouse, but Mac OS still asks you to go and turn on your mouse, which is, I guess, kind of funny. The way that we fix that is you can actually just throw a cheapo USB mouse. I think we use a Lenovo mouse, threw that onto another USB port, and then we just did everything remotely anyway. Just for some reason, even though it lets you operate the pointer with, like, it had a mouse, it didn't work unless there's a physical mouse plugged in, which makes no sense, but that's kind of just what it is. So I think the big challenge with the M1 Mac Minis is really just the fact that the pointer thing is a little bit wonky, and also the remote media did not work. And it wasn't just the 10G base T version. We also tried it on the 1 gig Ethernet. We have, I think, like 3 of those systems, and we tried on 2 of them and didn't work there either. So, and it did the same thing during setup. So I think that if you're trying to use these for your M1 Mac Minis, maybe not just yet. But again, that's something that could potentially be fixed in the future. All right, so let's talk about the video performance, because that's another really important aspect. Now, the latency on this solution is very good. It's definitely probably a top tier solution. It may not be the best one we've ever used, but it's pretty darn good. But there are 2 components that are super important to keep in mind, and you can actually adjust them in the newest version of TinyPilot. The first thing that you can do is you can change the frame rate. So you normally, and we have them usually on our local network set for 30 FPS, but if you want to save bandwidth, you might want to dial that back to something like 24 FPS or maybe 10 FPS or something that's lower, just to be able to, I guess, not have to push as many frames over the network, which lowers the amount of bandwidth you're using. The other big one is just the JPEG quality, and you can dial that back from 100 to 1. And we tried 1 and it looked horrible. I mean, this is what it looked like. I mean, this looks just absolutely terrible and borderline unusable. It even takes beautiful sites like ServeTheHome and makes them almost unreadable. You might wonder why that's important, and I'm actually showing 2 features here because I installed VNstat just to be able to do the monitoring of the Ethernet interface, and so we could see how much bandwidth is being used. And you can actually see that there's a pretty big difference between the lower end settings and also the higher end settings. The lower end, you can get it to go in the 2 to 3 megabits per second range. But if you are using the higher quality settings, you can get this to go over 50 megabits per second. And we're also showing that we're getting this over well over 100 megabits per second as well. I know to some people, okay, 100 megabits per second is not a huge deal. And if you're on a local area network and you have 10 gig networking, it probably isn't a big deal. But if you're on 1 gig or if you have only 100 gig networking, then that is definitely a big deal. Also, if you're on a WAN connection, say you have a server in a data center and you are on a hotspot on a beach somewhere trying to access your server because it's interrupting your vacation, that's a good example of where you may not get a 100 megabit or 50 megabit per second connection. You may be lucky if you get 2 or 3. And overall CPU performance, I mean, you could definitely see the CPU is working across like the 4 cores. You often see it in that 50+% CPU utilization rate. So it would be, I guess, hard to kind of have this kind of like high quality solution and also have a whole bunch of systems controlled by this Raspberry Pi unless something really changes on that end. You'd probably need a better encoder to be able to make that happen. Overall, this TinyPilot Voyager is absolutely awesome. I will tell you that, frankly, we have a bunch of the Lantronix Spiders. that are in the data center. And the reason that we have those is just because they have the VGA connection and they don't really have that many cables. This does definitely have a ton of cables. It looks like a rat's nest when you put it down, sitting inside of all its cables. Okay, maybe a bird's nest, but you get the idea. Still, at home, I've kept the Lantronix Spider as well as this TinyPilot handy, and I basically have not used this Lantronix Spider. I've only been using the TinyPilot for the last 5 months or so. And so in terms of ease of use and all those types of things, I actually think that this is an awesome project. Because if you have both side by side and you're always picking the TinyPilot over the Lantronix Spider, I think it's a pretty strong evidence that this is a very easy to use solution. Now for $299, it is definitely not inexpensive. I mean, you're definitely paying a premium for what you get here. I do think that there is 100% an opportunity for Michael and the TinyPilot team to go and create, I guess, something that's a little better integrated. I think that would be kind of cool, but really for like kind of a first generation product, I'm really happy with this. The cases, a 3D printed case, that's pretty nice. I mean, overall it works pretty darn well. And the fact of the matter is we have more features today than we had months ago, so I think that's great as well. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at the TinyPilot Voyager solution. And if you did, why don't you give us a like, click subscribe, turn on notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.